In this video, we're going to talk about some of the basic elements of jQuery syntax. So just to review, syntax is the reserved vocabulary and the special characters or formats that are associated with a programming language. So for example, the P tag and those open and close caret symbols are part of HTML syntax that you use all the time. For jQuery, these are some of the syntax features that you want to keep an eye out for. The $ is what accesses the jQuery library. It's actually the jQuery function, and it stands for jQuery. So if you wanted to, you could write out jQuery rather than using the $. Nobody does that, but that does in fact work, and I'll show you that a little bit later. The other thing that you use are parentheses to surround the target of your command or codes. So very often lines in jQuery will start with the $ and then parentheses and then a selector inside. And the selectors that jQuery uses are basically the same selectors that we use in CSS. You can use a period to access methods. And so that would be, I'll show you a sample line in just a second, but that would be like after your parenthesis, you put a period and then you put the method that you're using. And you can chain methods in jQuery. This is one of the things that makes it a really efficient language, is you can apply a series of different methods in a chain. And then just like in JavaScript, you do want semicolons at the ends of your lines. Here's what I mean by chaining methods. This would be an example of a line of jQuery with chained methods. So you'd start with your jQuery function, the $ symbol, your parentheses, you'd have the selector. And again, when we get into some coding, this will be much more clear. Then you'd put the dot, the first method, whatever parameters you need for that method. It's basically like when you call a function, right? You send the parameters. That's kind of how the methods work, and we'll see that as we go along. But then you can put another dot, a second method, more parameters, and you can keep going and going and going. And basically, it will apply all of those methods in the order from left to right that they are provided to whatever that target is that you've identified with the selector. So it would apply method 1 first, then 2, then 3, then 4, etc., and so forth until it gets to the end of the line. Okay, so now that we've been introduced to some of the basics of terminology and the different syntax, in particular the special characters that are used, let's go and take a look again at some lines of jQuery code. So as you recall, we've been working with this coin flip experiment file. It's the one that just gives the percentages of heads and tails based on 1,047 random flips of a coin, of a virtual coin. And we looked at the end of the last module, a couple of lines of jQuery code right here, and talked about how those were equivalent to this long form JavaScript code. And they work the exact same way. So now that we have some idea of the syntax under our belts, let's go ahead and look at these in more detail. So here's that $ that's telling it to access jQuery. And just as a reminder, in our HTML file, we need this line of script to include the jQuery library as part of our project. If you don't have this in your HTML file, then you can write all the $ you want and it won't do anything. So just a quick reminder there. So we have the $ to access jQuery, and then we have these parentheses. Now, this should remind you actually of format that we use in jQuery anyway, right? Take a look here in this function definition, right? We have the function name and then we put those parentheses. That's essentially what you're doing. You're calling the jQuery function. It's just the jQuery function is a very elaborate set of commands that allows you to use all of these different methods that we're going to talk about in more detail in subsequent videos. So that's really all that's going on here, is you're calling the jQuery function, and that's why we need this. And that's also why we do need to surround whatever we send, when any string that we send, like a literal string like this, quotation marks, right? Because we're basically passing a parameter into a function. So if you think of it that way, that may help make it more clear. And we're going to talk about those selectors in the next video. But in the meantime, just note that this is what's going on here. jQuery passing a parameter, dot, here's a method, HTML, that's a reserved command in jQuery, and then it gets a parameter, heads, and it basically writes whatever the value of this variable is into the page. Now notice, You do not want to surround variables in quotation marks, because if you do that, you're passing a string rather than the value of the variable. So see what happens there. See, now it just says the word heads. That is not what we wanted. So when you're using a variable, and same would hold true here, you can pass variables into this. You don't have to use literal values in this selector. And we'll see that as we continue on with our coding. But you want to, you know, with variables, you don't want those quotation marks. With literals, you do. It's a string. If it's a number, you can just directly send the number. Now, I do want to note, remember I mentioned that the $ itself is a shorthand. Just to reinforce this point that you're calling, you know, the jQuery function, you actually can replace $ with the word jQuery. That's what the $ is standing for. It's shorthand for the jQuery function. Notice I replaced that $ with the word jQuery, and when I go ahead and click on it, it still works just fine. So $ is equal to that. But why would you write out a word when you can just use a single symbol? So nobody actually uses the word jQuery. Coders really just use this $. So that's what I wanted to introduce to you here. Okay, so you get the idea, methods, and then again end with your semicolon, and then that forms a complete line of jQuery code that targets an element on the HTML page and then performs whatever the action is of the method that follows the dot. So that's an overview of jQuery syntax. And the next thing we want to talk about is those jQuery selectors.